Page 84. Chapter 4. Putting the House in Order. Actioning Reforms. As I have mentioned earlier, I was in Calcutta on the day of the emergency. I repeat, as I have mentioned earlier, I was in Calcutta on the day of the emergency was declared and returned to Delhi by an evening flight on 26 June 1975. I set about my job in earnest and launched a battle against economic offences as I had been instructed. On 27 June, at a meeting with senior revenue officials, Chairman, Direct Taxes, Chairman, Customs and Central Excise, Director, Revenue Intelligence, Director, Enforcement, and the Finance Secretary, along with a few others, I emphasized that the fight against economic offences had to be further strengthened in the wake of the new developments. We discussed the economic and enforcement measures needed to tackle the problem, after which I asked the officers to identify the legislative or administrative support necessary to pursue our agenda. Para. An ordinance was promulgated by the President on 1st July 1975, effectively amending the COFE-POSA, or the Conservation of Foreign Exchange and Prevention of Smuggling Activities Act. The COFE-POSA had been enacted in 1974 to deal with smugglers and foreign exchange racketeers. However, since 1974, when preventive detention was adopted as a measure to nab the big fish and bring them to book, some deficiencies had come to light. Page 85. The one main difficulty was that the High Court started releasing detainees if even one of the many grounds of detention was found invalid. This came to light when the Delhi High Court delivered its judgment in April 1975 on the detention, open bracket, under this Act, close bracket, of 5 suspected smugglers. The High Court released 2, Sukar Narayan Bakhia and Yusuf Patel. The implication of the judgment was that if just one of the many grounds on which a person was detained was found invalid, he could be released. As a result, a large number of similar appeals were subsequently filed before the Delhi High Court, and this weakened the government's resolve to tackle the problem. This loop and other shortcomings of the Act were plugged by an amendment of COFE-POSA, and the Act was made stronger to deal with the situation adequately. Now, a detention order could not be deemed invalid or inoperative merely because one or some of the grounds were found to be not maintainable. Para. A cabinet committee consisting of Om Mehta, Minister of the State for Home Affairs, Dr. Sarojini Mahishi, Minister of State of Law and Justice, and I was constituted to deal with smuggling and other economic offences, and we first met on 2nd July 1975. The Cabinet Committee issued 3 directives. 1. Immediate arrest of smugglers ordered to be detained but yet absconding. With the aim of tracing and arresting them, appropriate instructions were to be issued to state governments, and photographs of the proclaimed offenders, I repeat, offenders, were to be published and orders for the attachment of their properties issued. 2. Jailed smugglers were to be treated in accordance with the prescribed rules. No unauthorized concessions were to be allowed to them. Open bracket. This instruction became necessary as there were reports of some smugglers carrying on their activities from jail in connivance with jail officials. Questions were also raised in Parliament to this effect. Close bracket. Number 3. The confiscated boats, open bracket, a significant amount of smuggling took place between the Gulf and coastal Maharashtra and Gujarat, close bracket, were to be put to immediate use in anti-smuggling operations. Recruitment of the requisite crew was thus sanctioned. Para. Consequently, during night-long operations over 2nd and 3rd July 1975, as many as 12 top smugglers were arrested in Bombay, Delhi, and Madras. The arrested persons included those who had been released by the Delhi High Court in April 1975. This was the beginning, and during the period of the emergency, a large number of economic offenders were detained. While a few may have been detained unjustly, more were without doubt held for activities that were inimical to the interests of law-abiding citizens. I addressed a press conference in Calcutta to explain the new measures aimed at controlling economic offences. According to the report that appeared in Business Standard, open bracket, 9th July 1975, quoting PTI, close bracket, page 86. Stringent measures were being taken to effectively curb smuggling activities and other economic offences in the country as a follow-up of the new economic programs announced by the Prime Minister, the Union Minister of State for Finance, Pranab Mukherjee, said in Calcutta on Tuesday, reports PTI. Mr. Mukherjee said that the anti-smuggling operations would be intensified, and with this end in view, top-level meetings would be held in 5 smuggling-prone centres in the country. The 5 centres are Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, Ahmedabad, and Cochin. The minister said 243 smugglers, against whom detention orders had been issued, were absconding throughout the country, including 51 in West Bengal. Of them, action had already been initiated against 107 smugglers to attach their property after declaring them as proclaimed offenders. In the first week of July 1975, goods worth 5 lakh rupees were seized. Against 82 detention orders issued under COFEPOSA, 44 persons were arrested, while 12 were absconding. In the case of 16 others, writ petitions were pending in the High Court in Calcutta. Mr. Mukherjee said, Para, though the action plan for rounding up absconding smugglers was executed, we came up against a few roadblocks. Attaching their property with the aim of compelling them to surrender proved to be difficult. It was found that the smugglers did not hold the property in their own names. That is, most of their fixed assets were benami or unaccounted for in terms of title. Not only that, given the resources at their command, some of them could avail of the best legal and medical services to avoid detention on health grounds. At times, even after detention, there were kingpins, who had to be released on health grounds on account of certificates issued by eminent medical practitioners. During this entire phase, we had to contend with these problems, constantly trying to plug loopholes. Para. Another legislation was passed by both Houses of Parliament in January 1976 for confiscating the properties belonging to smugglers. The SAFEM, open bracket, FOPA, close bracket, or the smugglers and foreign exchange manipulators, open bracket, Forfeiture of Property Act, close bracket. While speaking on the issue of Parliament, I emphasized that the legislation would send a clear message to smugglers and foreign exchange manipulators that they would no longer be able to enjoy their tainted money. It had been framed so as to ensure that habitual offenders failed to hoodwink the law. Page 88. The main feature of the legislation was that if one half of the investment in a property remained unproven, options would be given to the persons affected to pay a fine in lieu of confiscation, with this fine being equal to 1 1/5 of the value of the unexplained investment. I explained that the legislation empowered the government to deprive smugglers and foreign exchange manipulators of their ill-gotten properties and was to be administered by senior central government officers, not below the rank of a joint secretary. Competent authorities were to be situated at important places like Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, and Ahmedabad. An appellate authority was to be established under a retired judge of the Supreme Court or High Courts or a person eligible to be appointed as judge. There could only be one appeal against the order of forfeiture by the competent authority to this appellate body. After the ordinance was issued, the Revenue Department started collecting information on the properties of the smugglers. In Bombay, such information was collected for nearly 1,000 people. Para. The success of these interventions notwithstanding, we realized that anti-smuggling operations could never be successful so long as there existed a huge gap between the demand and the supply of consumer goods, some of these being synthetic fibers, clothing, and watches. We decided to increase the production of such items. Duties on man-made fabrics manufactured in the country were suitably adjusted so as to increase indigenous production. And HMT, open bracket, Hindustan Machine Tools, a government undertaking which manufactured watches, close bracket, was encouraged to set up new units to produce more watches. Para. Curbing the smuggling of gold was not that easy. While seizure under the Gold Control Act had increased significantly, this area remained a problem. Given the lack of social security, gold has always been the asset of choice in India. The continuous apprehension of the value of gold in the country thus acted as an incentive for gold smuggling. Page 89. During the late 1960s, Morarji Desai tried to combat the rising demand for gold by passing the Gold Control Act, but the legislation failed in its endeavor and instead created business problems for goldsmiths. The long and short of the matter was that gold continued to be smuggled into India. Though gold had two gold mines, I repeat, though India had two gold mines in Karnataka, our indigenous gold production was not more than 10 to 12 tons a year. So the problem couldn't be tackled by increased indigenous production either. Para. The issue with gold notwithstanding, some of these measures had a salutary effect on curbing smuggling activities in India. News received from intelligence sources pointed to the accumulation of huge quantities of stocks of various items in places like Dubai and Hong Kong, from where goods were regularly smuggled into India. Para. COFEPOSA, though not repealed, became inoperational during the 3-year rule of the Janata and the Lok Dal. In fact, the Janata Party Finance Minister H.M. Patel went to the extent of suggesting that he was not interested in the departments, open bracket, income tax or others, close bracket, within the Ministry of Revenue, conducting tax raids as, according to him, open inverted commas, the raids were politically motivated, close inverted comma. As a result of this attitude, the war against economic offenders, initiated before the emergency and strengthened during this period, could not be carried to its logical conclusion. Para. After taking over as Minister of State for Finance in December 1975, I carried on with the work initiated by my predecessor, K.R. Ganesh. The Income Tax Department was instructed to bring new assesses within the tax net, an instruction based on the knowledge that a large number of professionals and self-employed persons were avoiding tax. Page 90. As, open inverted comma, survey, search, seizure close inverted comma, intensified, many people who had so far avoided paying tax volunteered to disclose their concealed income and were brought within the tax net. The provision of voluntary disclosure was made an inbuilt feature of the tax system by amending the tax laws, open bracket, direct, close bracket. In 1974 to 75, the number of professionals and self-employed persons brought under the tax net touched 1,33,642. Of these, 1,08,012 were new assessors belonging to the professional classes: lawyers, open bracket, 78,638, close bracket, chartered accountants, 11,243, doctors, 8,366, engineers, 15,278, contractors, 6,981, and architects, 2,724. Given the significant increase in the number of taxpayers, there was a resultant increase in tax revenue too. Para. We then focused on simplifying the procedure of remittances from abroad. I repeat, from abroad. A large number of non-resident Indians sent money to relatives in India, mostly through clandestine routes. Smugglers collected foreign exchange from people abroad and paid their relatives in India in the local currency, with transactions carried out at higher exchange rates. In fact, they built a parallel banking system to fund smuggling and ran it efficiently. Our task was to demolish the arrangement, and with this aim, a large number of branches of Indian banks were opened abroad in localites with high concentrations of Indians. Remittance procedures were simplified in consultation with the Reserve Bank of India, open bracket, RBI, close bracket, and operators of these unauthorized banking system were nabbed under the Preventive Detention Act. To encourage the receipt of foreign exchange through regular channels and to ensure that part of the investable surplus of non-resident Indians went into Indian banks, 2 deposit schemes were introduced. Non-resident Indians could deposit foreign currency, US dollars and British pounds, in Indian banks, and they could get back their money, both the principal and the interest, in foreign currencies. Page 91. Higher rates of interest were provided for these accounts. Alternatively, such depositors could also choose a plan of receiving Indian rupees against their foreign currency deposits. Both these deposit schemes had a lock-in period to avoid speculation. Additionally, concessions were given to non-resident Indians investing in India, including in real estate. These measures were taken to ensure that the money to fund smuggling activities was not available. They also helped India's merge foreign exchange reserves to swell. From October 1974 to November 1975, that is, in 14 months, remittances through legal channels increased by rupees 441 crore. From an average of rupees 41 crore per month before the crackdown, remittances spiraled to rupees 67 crore per month. In the post-emergency period, foreign exchange reserves increased by 144% and 93%, respectively, in 2 years, against 5% and 21%, respectively, in the 2 years before the emergency. Para. Our strategy to tackle economic offences started yielding results. The raids and searches by the Income Tax Department made life difficult for tax evaders and black money operators. A total of 2,029 economic tax raids were conducted during the financial year of 1974 to 75, with 1,523 more between April and November 1975. Assets seized during this period were valued at rupees 17 crore and rupees 14 crore respectively. In short, an environment was created where tax dodgers had to spend sleepless nights. Para. It was in this scenario that a group of top industrialists met me and suggested that the government consider giving tax dodgers the chance of voluntarily disclosing their concealed income and wealth. The influential Congressman Rajni Patel was a strong advocate of this scheme. I was initially disinclined. I repeat, I was initially disinclined. I not only agreed with the Wanchu Committee report that such an action seemed to reward dishonesty at the cost of honest taxpayers, but also knew there would be an unfavorable public reaction. But as my officers thought the suggestion viable, I asked them to study its feasibility and put together a report on the results of similar schemes introduced earlier. Similar schemes had been introduced on 3 occasions in the past. During the tenures of C.D. Deshmukh, T.T. Krishnamachari, and Morarji Desai, but the response had not been encouraging. But my officers remained eager to give it another try. It was then that I discussed the issue with the finance minister, who had always been a valuable guide to me. He suggested that I talk to a cross-section of people without giving an indication of what the government was contemplating. Para. Having done that, I also talked to the Prime Minister, who advised me to prepare a note indicating the pros and cons of the scheme. After all these exercises were done, and having gained broad support from my senior colleagues, I submitted a cabinet note. And then the voluntary disclosure scheme was approved by the cabinet and put into operation through an ordinance on 8th October 1975. The essential feature of the scheme was that the rate of income tax to be payable under the scheme was 50%, open bracket, against the normal rate of 60%, close bracket, and the name and identity of the declarer would be kept confidential. 2.5% of the disclosed income and wealth was to be invested in specified government securities. There would be no penalty and prosecution for the income and wealth so disclosed under the scheme. However, the immunity would not be extended if, on subsequent information, any undeclared concealed income and/or wealth was unearthed. People detained under COFE-POSA were not eligible to avail of the scheme. Para, an all-out attempt was made to make this effort successful. Page 93. The then chairman of the Central Board of Direct Taxes, open brackets, CBDT, close bracket, S.R. Mehta made a valuable contribution to its success. A two-pronged strategy was adopted. Raids and searches were intensified in almost all major cities. I toured many cities, as did S.R. Mehta and other CBDT board members. We addressed professional organizations, chambers of commerce, tax consultants, lawyers, chartered accountants, clubs, and societies, throughout urging people to buy peace by taking the opportunity offered by the scheme. At such meetings, I used to say, open inverted comma, I would invite every tax dodger to be our guest by 31st December 1975, and if they do not accept my offer, I shall be an unwelcome guest at their houses after 31st December, close inverted comma. This statement became very popular. We also launched a massive information campaign throughout the country. Hoardings, posters, and media advertising started appearing. Para. From October to December that year, I addressed 27 meetings across the country. In the initial stages, the response from taxpayers was not very encouraging. A few people responded to the scheme, but the amount received was disappointing. There was then a suggestion to extend the date. I refused to accept the suggestion, and the finance minister, as well as the chairman of CBDT, supported my view. Any extension would only expose the government as weak. I spoke to the Prime Minister, who, too, agreed with my view, but said that all efforts should be made to ensure that the scheme did not flop. I assured her that it would not. Para. From the second week of December, the drive gathered momentum. It was made clear that there would be no extension of the date, and people started availing of the scheme. In the last few days of the month, the tempo reached its peak. During this period, a couple of big business houses were raided, creating some panic among tax evaders. Some thought that these raids were organized deliberately to inject fear among the people, but it was not so. Page 94. Those who were acquainted with the system knew that such raids were the culmination of 2 or 3 months of information gathering and due diligence. And in the case of big corporates, extra care was taken. Consequently, for raids executed in November to December 1975, preparatory groundwork needed to have been done months ahead. Para. When the results of the voluntary disclosure scheme started coming in, I was in Chandigarh attending the 75th session of the Indian National Congress. I received the figures over the telephone and was specifically asked by the Prime Minister to quote the figures and explain the economic policies in detail in my speech to the economic session. Footnote 36. The delegates broke into loud applause as I read out the figures of the concealed income and wealth disclosed through the scheme. Close to 1,500 crore rupees. I told the session that this gain to the national exchequer was the Prime Minister's New Year's gift to the nation. Para. Many had doubted the success of this scheme. Open inverted comma. This young man will burn his fingers one day. Close inverted comma. Some senior ministers had jokingly commented. One exception was, I repeat, one exception was Babu Jagjeevan Ram. Open inverted comma. Pranab is clever enough, and surely he will be successful. Close inverted comma. Jagjeevan Ram had quipped. When I informed him of the result, he hugged me warmly. Open inverted comma. Well done. Close inverted comma. He said. Para. I came back to Delhi and met C. Subramanian, who was still recovering from his illness. He agreed to pay 1 month's salary as bonus to all staff associated with the scheme, for which we later faced some criticism from our colleagues who contended that government officials should not be rewarded for doing their routine duty. Footnote 36. Illness had prevented Finance Minister C. Subramaniam from attending the Congress session that year. Consequently, I took his place. Page 95. Technically correct as they were, they had failed to appreciate the facts fully. While it was the routine job of the Income Tax Department, the scheme would not have succeeded without the total commitment of the people executing it. I thought I was more than justified in strongly defending the decision to pay the bonus. Para. On 2nd January 1976, I addressed the nation on All India Radio, detailing the scheme and its results, besides outlining our future program. The national broadcast was relayed by every radio station, open bracket, see Appendix 7 for extracts from the broadcast, close bracket. The Times of India, open bracket, Delhi 2nd January 1976, close bracket, in its editorial observed, the Union Minister of State for Revenue and Banking, Mr. Mukherjee, open bracket, Pranab, close bracket, is fully justified in taking credit for the success of the voluntary disclosure scheme. Whether only 10% of the total amount of black money with the public has surfaced as a result, or twice as much, the fact remains that rupees 1,500 crores of concealed income and wealth has now come into the tax net, and the government's own revenue has swollen because of the windfall gain of rupees 250 crores. By contrast, the aggregate sums disclosed in all the three previous schemes floated till 1965 were a mere rupees 265 crores, and the tax yield no more than rupees 62 crores. The two reasons advanced by the Wanchu Commission in 1971 for opposing the idea of reintroducing any such scheme were that it would shake the confidence of honest taxpayers in the capacity of the government to deal with the lawbreakers and undermine the morale of the tax administration. But in this event, it fears on either score. I repeat, but in this event, its fears on either score have proved groundless. For the latter had launched a vigorous drive against tax evaders fairly early in the day and managed to keep the pressure on them even when the scheme was in force. Page 96. In consequence, the yield from direct taxes this year, before the new scheme came into force, went up by nearly 30% despite a cut, I repeat, despite a cut in the rates of personal taxation. What is more, the amount of disclosure has exceeded even the most optimistic expectation of officialdom. That apart, the velocity of circulation of black money, which exerts an inflationary pressure on prices, has been indisputably slowed down. One can, however, deny that the concealed income or wealth that still plagues the economy is many times more than what has been revealed to the authorities. But that only highlights the importance of not only stepping up the momentum of the current drive against the tax dodgers, by also rationalizing the whole structure of taxation, as Mr. Mukherjee, open bracket, Pranab, close bracket, has indeed promised to do. Plainly, action in a number of areas is urgently called for if the tax system is to subserve the wider objectives of promoting growth, savings, individual efforts, and social equity. Para. Many other newspapers wrote articles and editorials and, editorial comments that were appreciative of the success of the scheme. Para. In an editorial, the Indian Express, open bracket, Delhi, 2nd January 1976, close bracket, made the following observation. The Minister of Revenue, Pranab Mukherjee, has hinted at further rationalization of the structure of direct taxation. Exercises in this connection are going on in the Finance Ministry. Their outcome will be known when the Finance Ministry presents his budget for the next, their outcome will be known when the Finance Minister presents his budget for the next financial year, a few weeks hence. Rationalization, as it has been advocated by and on behalf of different interest groups, is merely an euphemism for a reduction in the marginal rates of direct tax liability. The case for it has been greatly strengthened by buoyance in revenue collections after sizable reduction in their rates for top income brackets in response to the recommendation of the Wanchu Committee report. Page 97. The success of the voluntary disclosure scheme is also attributed to the generous concessions, concessions, immunities, and incentives offered to those willing to take advantage of it to declare their unaccounted incomes and wealth. The problem of tax reforms has, however, wider dimensions than a general reduction in tax rate. There is obviously a limit to tax concessions which the government can grant it if, can grant if it is not to erode its ability to raise adequate resources to fulfill its responsibilities and obligations in the sphere of administration, defense, and development. It is also to be considered whether the whole of fiscal policy in regulating the production and consumption pattern and the distribution of income and wealth on which so much stress was laid in the past should be totally extinguished. The implications, the implications of any, open inverted comma, rationalization, close inverted comma, of the tax structure are thus of far-reaching nature and will impinge on many a proclaimed objective of socio-economic change. Para. The statement, the Statesman in its editorial, open bracket, Delhi, 2nd January 1976, close bracket, observed. The need for rationalization of direct taxes received more than the usual emphasis in the parliamentary debate on the bill to replace the Ordinance on Voluntary Disclosure Scheme. The Minister for Revenue and Banking, Pranab Mukherjee, almost conceded it is principle. Even those who dismissed the Wanchu Committee's suggestion for reduction in the maximum rates of income tax to check tax evasion as wishful thinking appear to have had second thoughts after the success of the voluntary disclosure scheme, based on much lower rates of taxes than those payable if there had been no evasion. There is now cautious optimism about the possibility of a realistic attitude being adopted in the next budget to some of the issues relating to taxation. There is a long list of suggestions from the tax executives and Chamber of Commerce, which include several responsible and practicable proposals. The loss of revenue, if any, from accepting them will be more than made up through better collections and larger use arising from economic growth. Page 98. Para. Tax reforms were not confined merely to reducing the rate of taxes, but were supplemented by institutional arrangements too. Such as the stepping up of a settlement commission recommended by a number of expert groups. A large portion of revenue was held up every year due to litigation, and it was thought advisable to have an agency like the Commission whose verdict would be acceptable both to the department and the assessees. Such was the environment created that even tax dodgers and evaders were prepared to cooperate through this institutional arrangement. Para. Another tribunal was set up to identify and take necessary action with regard to undisclosed properties of smugglers, open bracket, particularly in Mumbai, where real estate has always been a business with huge cash flows, close bracket, and foreign exchange manipulators. The law was passed, and this tribunal was to implement the provisions of this act. Para. The attempt at reforming tax laws was not confined to direct taxes. Indirect taxes also came into the ambit, particularly as huge amounts were collected through central excise and customs. In fact, during the 1970s, the share of indirect tax to total tax revenue had already reached a staggering 75%. Not surprisingly, there was a need to initiate reforms in this area too. During this time, I made a minor attempt at some reforms in customs duty when we switched to BTN, open bracket, Brussels tariff nomenclature, close bracket, through legislation, I repeat, through legislation. Footnote 37. An expert committee, footnote 38, was appointed to consider reforms in central excise, open bracket, Finance Minister C. Subramaniam announced this in his budget speech of 1976 to 77, close bracket, under the chairmanship of L.K. Jha, the then governor of Jammu and Kashmir. The committee submitted its interim report in 1977. Para. While valuable recommendations were made, some of which I repeat, para. While valuable recommendations were made, some of which remain relevant even today, we could not put this report into action. By the time the committee submitted the report, we were out of office. With an attitude of, open inverted commas, whatever the Congress did was bad, close inverted commas, the Janta government did not examine the report's recommendations, let alone implement them. When the Congress returned to power in 1980 and R. Venkataraman was entrusted with the Ministry of Finance, he did not show much interest in the report either. Rather, he preferred some of the recommendations of L.K. Jha, who was then working in a different capacity as a one-man economic administration reforms commission. By the time I took over as finance minister in 1982, many of the recommendations had lost its relevance. However, I accepted those which were still relevant and implemented them in my taxation policy. Footnote 39. Footnotes. Footnote 37. This is a standardized system for the classification of imported goods for statistical and duty determination purposes. Footnote 38. Its members were M.V. Arunachalam, Raja Chellayya, G. Sengupta, G.B. Nawalkar, K. Narasimhan, and Manmohan Singh, then the chief economic advisor. Manmohan Singh resigned from the committee on his appointment as Secretary to Government of India, and S.S. Marathe was appointed in his stead. Footnote 39. One interesting development took place with regard to taxation under the newly introduced tariff item number 68. When it was introduced for the first time in the budget of 1976, we did not take any credit in our revenue calculation of this item. The position we maintained in Parliament was that this proposal was not a revenue-yielding measure, but we wanted to have it for statistical purposes. The then Finance Secretary, H.N. Ray, made a nice remark before the Finance Minister, open inverted comma, "Sir, To you, this may appear as an innocuous, non-revenue item, meant only for statistical purpose. But your successors may not look at this item with the same approach. You are showing them a green pasture for higher revenue yield. And that is exactly what happened. I repeat, higher revenue yield, close inverted comma. And that is exactly what happened. Within a couple of years, the rate of taxation under this item increased from 1% to 8 to 10% and was considered an important revenue earning measure. Later, however, VP Singh abolished this item by restructuring the excise tariff. The idea of MODVAT, open inverted commas, modified value added tax, close bracket, introduced by him in his budget proposals for the year 1986 to 87 also came from this report. Page 100. During 1975 to 77, a number of reforms were initiated in the Ministry of Finance, and not least among those was banking reform. When the new socio-economic programs were adopted, it was observed that banks were to play a crucial role in implementing them. As many as 12 points in the 20-point program were directly or indirectly related to the banking system. Para. The first major initiative in this area was the establishment of regional rural banks, open bracket, RRBs, close bracket, to cater to rural credit. The solution of unauthorized money lending mentioned in the 20-point program was not possible without providing adequate facilities for institutional credit. A committee, open bracket, under the chairmanship of K. Narasimhan, the then Additional Secretary for Economic Affairs, close bracket, was appointed to make recommendations for providing institutional credit to rural areas. According to the RBI study, open bracket 1974 to 75, close bracket, the total requirement of rural credit amounted to rupees 3,000 crore per year. I repeat, rupees 3,000 crore per year. All institutional arrangements available at that time, open bracket, including cooperative societies, land development banks, rural branches of commercial banks, etc., close bracket, could not provide more than rupees 800 crore a year. In other words, not even 30% of the total requirement of rural credit was available from institutional arrangements. For the remaining 70%, the rural population had to depend on money lenders whose lending rates ranged from 30% to 50%. Therefore, it was felt that an institution was necessary to provide rural credit and save the rural population from the clutches of money lenders, and thus the Narasimhan Committee recommended the establishment of RRBs. Page 101. Para. The model was to be that of a low-cost banking institution which would combine the efficiency of commercial banks with the flexibility of cooperative societies. RRBs were to be grown as local institutions steeped in the area's cultural ethos and manned by people possessing intimate knowledge of the local economy and culture. The objective of these banks was to cater to the needs of the weakest of the weak, small and marginal farmers, agricultural laborers, rural artisans, and sharecroppers. Para. The ordinance was passed on 26 September 1975, and the formal inauguration was scheduled for 2nd October, the birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. On that day, 5 RRBs were inaugurated, 2 in Uttar Pradesh, open bracket, Moradabad and Gorakhpur, close bracket, 1 in Rajasthan, open bracket, Lawan, close bracket, 1 in Haryana, open bracket, Bhiwani, close bracket, and the one in West Bengal, open bracket, Malda, close bracket. Finance Minister C. Subramanian inaugurated the first RRB in Moradabad, and I, along with Siddhartha Shankar Ray, the then Chief Minister of West Bengal, inaugurated the Gaur Gramin Bank in Malda. Each RRB was to be sponsored by a nationalized bank with an authorized share capital of rupees 1 crore and paid-up capital of rupees 25 lakh. The union government sponsoring banks and the state governments were to be shareholders to the tune of 50%, 35%, and 15% respectively. One of the 9 directors, 4 were to be nominated by the union government, 3 by the sponsoring bank, and 2 by the state government. Para. In the Malda function, I announced that by the end of the financial year 1975 to 76, 15 banks were to be opened, and by the end of 1976 to 77, the number of such banks was expected to reach 50. I emphasize the need for stepping up agricultural credit and the role assigned to RRBs in that sphere. Page 102. In fact, after December 1975, when the Department of Banking was entrusted to me, I stepped up the activities of RRBs considerably. As many as 48 banks were established by March 1977. In West Bengal alone, apart from the Gaur Gramin Bank, 3 more were established. Mayurakshi Gramin Bank at Birbhum, Mallabhum Gramin Bank at Bankura, covering 3 districts, open bracket, Midnapur, Bankura, Purulia, close bracket, and North Bengal, Kshetriya Gramin Bank at Kuch Bihar, open bracket, Kuch Bihar, Jalpaiguri, and Darjeeling, close bracket. Para. With the defeat of the Congress government, it seemed that the fate of the RRBs was sealed, as the Janata Party government stated that these were set up to serve the partisans' interests of the Congress. Fortunately, good sense prevailed at the end of the day, and an expert committee under the chairmanship of Professor Dantwala, an eminent economist, was set up to look into the issue. The Dantwala Committee, in its report, highlighted the relevance of RRBs in tackling problems of rural credit and also made some recommendations. However, in spite of this validation, the expansion of RRBs did not garner the desired momentum. We had to wait till the Congress returned to power in 1980, when it set a target of 170 RRBs during the 6th five-year plan. The target was achieved by 31st March 1985. Para. In January 1976, the ordinance establishing RRBs was replaced by an act. While piloting the bill in the Lok Sabha, I pointed out that each state would have its share of RRBs, but priority would be given to unbanked states. The credit requirement in rural areas was estimated at Rupees 3,000 crore by the end of 1978 to 79, and Out of this amount, a sum of rupees 1,700 crore was expected to be provided by the rural branches of commercial banks, cooperative societies, and other such institutions. The balance of rupees 1,300 crore was to be provided by RRBs if the entire credit requirement of the rural areas was to be met through institutional arrangements. Page 103. I further assured the members that the rules governing RRBs would be simpler than those of commercial banks. I disagreed with two suggestions made by some members. A, to have elected representatives of Kisan Sabhas and other such entities on the board of directors, and B, to make RRB pay scales at par with those of commercial banks. My logic for opposing the former suggestion was that the nomination route was better given that professionals and experts were needed on the board. Experts in agriculture or allied areas could be nominated by any of the three authorities, open bracket, union government, state government, and sponsoring bank, close bracket. My argument against parity in pay scales was simple. If these banks were to be operated at reduced costs, we could not afford the higher pay scales of commercial banks. Moreover, I pointed to an earlier formulation that pay scales of the employees in rural banks should be at par with those of state government employees at a similar level. Para, keeping in view a variety of factors, the nationalization of 14 scheduled commercial banks a while ago, the rapid growth in deposit mobilization, and the felt need for social banking, in December 1975, a separate Department of Revenue and Banking was carved out of the Ministry of Finance and placed under my responsibility. I was appointed Minister of State in charge. Para, I decided to have my first meeting with the chief executives of nationalized banks, footnote 40, identifying the important areas for discussion. Footnote 40. The meeting was attended by all chief executives of nationalized banks, the governor and the deputy governor of the RBI, the secretary to the government of India in the Department of Banking, the chief economic advisor, and other senior officers. The meeting was held at the conference room of North Block on 24th February 1976. Advances to the priority sector, branch expansion, deposit mobilization, and a focus on Sikh industries and bad investments by banks. Page 104. I focused on the 12 points in the 20-point program which were related to banks, and emphasized that banks had an important role to play in eliminating rural indebtedness. I stressed the need for creating rural banks for the specific task, open inverted comma, I am hoping that the attitude of each one of the rural banks would be something in the nature of Operation Credit Flood, close inverted comma. The need for the flow of credit to the handloom sector was emphasized. This sector of the Indian economy was very important from the point of view of both employment and foreign exchange earning. To this end, there was need for banks to undertake, open inverted comma, a critical assessment of their lending experiences and the problem of overdues in respect of recoveries, close inverted comma. I explained the action plan for the handloom sector. As many as 13 intensive development projects and 20 export production. I repeat, and 20 export production projects were to be established. The government agreed to fund them fully by providing 75% loans and 25% grants in aid. The resources to fund a major part of these projects would have to come from government financing. I advised them to liaise with state governments so as to be able to provide the necessary assistance to this sector. Para. The question of loans to Sikh industries was also discussed. I pointed out that huge amounts of bank money were locked up in Sikh private industries. Some amount of the bank's credit got frozen when an industrial unit was taken over by the government under the IDR Act, footnote 41. Normally, a moratorium was declared on all pre-takeover liabilities of these units, and bank advances were also subject to such moratorium. As a result, bank profitability reduced as, open inverted comma, bad debts, close inverted comma, increased every year. I pointed out that the banks should be able to spot the first signs of trouble by monitoring the unit's cash flow. If this was done carefully, remedial steps could be taken at an early stage. I observed, open inverted commas, what is therefore necessary is for the banks to devise a suitable information system to detect cases of incipient sickness so that the corrective action can be taken well in time. Close inverted comma. Footnotes. Footnote 41. The Industries, open bracket, Development and Regulation, close bracket, Act 1951, which provided for the development and regulation of certain industries.